Good evening. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the privilege of serving as director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute. On behalf of Jennifer Rabb, president of Hunter College, it's a pleasure to welcome all of you tonight for another virtual Roosevelt House presentation, the second of our fall season. This is a program that I must say makes me especially eager to return to Roosevelt House, to our physical home on East 65th Street, because of its direct relevance to tonight's topic. But I'm pleased, if not to see you, then at least to have you see us and have the opportunity to participate again in one of our Zoom programs. Before the feature attraction, just one coming attraction to note. Our next program, coming in early October, will present best-selling author David Michaelis on his new one-volume biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, appropriately called Eleanor, and it's already being hailed as a major contribution to the Roosevelt legacy. I urge you to tune in when we announce that program. Tonight, we're going to turn to another essential voice in FDR's ear, who, like Eleanor, advocated for progressive values and economic and racial justice. With Election Day fast approaching and the phrase New Deal again in the air, this is a perfect moment to consider the life and legacy of that consummate New Dealer, Henry A. Wallace. Wallace was, of course, FDR's Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Commerce, and in between, his third-term vice president. It's, as we mentioned, especially appropriate to have this discussion from virtual Roosevelt House, because in February 1933, Henry Wallace visited the House, probably to discuss agricultural reforms and his role in the administration that would take office in just a few weeks. Of course, the programs that were discussed at Roosevelt House helped the nation's farmers out of the Depression and set the country on a trajectory of liberty and justice. Tonight, I'm delighted to welcome author John Nichols, who has created a compelling new book about the Wallace legacy. In addition to his duties as Washington correspondent for The Nation, where his hard-hitting journalism continues to hold our leaders to account, he's a contributing writer for The Progressive, In These Times, and he's associate editor of his hometown daily, the Madison, Wisconsin Capital Times. And there he provides essential perspective to his community on the nation's most vital topics. He is also a pioneer of the political blogosphere and a trusted and indispensable progressive voice with a viewpoint that is always informed by history. His work has been cited in debates on the floor of Congress, and his incisive commentary has been featured on radio, podcasts, television, and in documentary films. Gore Vidal, of all people, once lionized the rigor and force of John's work with language usually reserved for actual progressive warriors. Vidal said, "Of all the giant slayers now afoot in the great American desert, John Nichols' sword is the sharpest." And since Vidal was usually indifferent, even hostile to his fellow writers, myself included, I will admit, I'm in awe that he had such nice things to say about our guest tonight. So that's quite a badge of honor for John Nichols. Among his other contributions are the books, The Death and Life of American Journalism, The Media Revolution That Will Begin the World Again, and People Get Ready, The Fight Against a Jobless Economy. He also wrote The Genius of Impeachment, The Founder's Cure for Royalism. This evening we mark his latest, and the title is The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, the enduring legacy of Henry Wallace's anti-fascist, anti-racist politics. Here, John Nichols invites renewed focus on an FDR cabinet member he holds as responsible for the success of the New Deal, really as much responsible as anyone aside from FDR himself. I'm looking forward to that discussion. Wallace's campaigns within the administration for liberal reform made him one of the earliest to excite the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And as John shows, it was Wallace who initiated some of the battles that today's progressives continue to fight for racial justice and healthcare, for example, as human rights, just to name two. Also elucidated in John's book is the story of what Wallace got in return. And this part will be painful to many readers. Party bosses and segregationists who blocked him from running for another term on the Roosevelt ticket in 1944, frustrating not only Wallace's political future, but the future of progressivism itself. Consider that without losing his spot on the ticket in 1944, Henry Wallace would have been president of the United States just a year later. But John's book, like its hero, doesn't despair. As the Reverend Jesse Jackson has observed of his new book, John Nichols recognizes that fights that were not won in the past by advocates of economic and racial justice and peace can now be won if we are determined enough and hopeful enough to carry the struggle forward. We're delighted also to have with us tonight to moderate our discussion none other than David Wallace Douglas, who is a writer, an environmental lawyer, an advocate for environmental sustainability in underdeveloped countries, and also the grandson of Henry A. Wallace. David is picked up not just on his grandfather's legacy of caring for the land and those whom it supports, but that of his great-grandfather, Henry C. Wallace, who also served as Secretary of Agriculture, in his case under President Warren Harding. David is the author of Wilderness Sojourn, Notes on the Desert Silence, and Letters of Faith, and he's the co-author with his wife Deborah of Pilgrims in the Kingdom, Travels in Christian Britain. With his intimate connection to the man at the heart and soul of John Nichols' book, and also his deep familiarity with his grandfather's endeavors and accomplishments, David Wallace Douglas is the perfect person to join in conversation with John Nichols at Roosevelt House this evening. Before I hand it over to our guests, I want to extend a special word of thanks to the editor and publisher of The Nation and a longtime friend of Roosevelt House, Katrina vanden Heuvel, who first brought this book to our attention, and whose father, Roosevelt House Advisory Board member, Ambassador William vanden Heuvel, remains a source of inspiration to Roosevelt House, to Hunter College, and to me personally, as an advisor on FDR's legacy and also about the challenges today. I think the ambassador is on our Zoom tonight, and I especially hope so because it gives me the opportunity to say in public for the first time, and only a few months late, not bad in an era of social isolation, happy 90th birthday to a great American, Bill vanden Heuvel. Tonight, for those of you who are familiar with our routine, you will know this. We will have a discussion lasting about 45 minutes, followed by a moderated question and answer period. I urge you all to use the Q&A function on your laptops or your computers or phones to post questions that you'd like to have raised with our guests later. With that, thank you all for joining us tonight, and please welcome John Nichols and David Wallace Douglas.
Great, thank you very much, Harold. John, it's good to see you tonight.
It's a great pleasure to see you, my friend, and I'm honored to. I really feel like I should be interviewing you, not the other way around.
Yeah, there'd be a lot of people disappointed if you did. So let me start with a question, if I could. The issues covered by your book, my grandfather's concern with poverty, with racism, with inequality, with the environment, both here in the United States and abroad, seem more timely each passing decade, particularly this election year of 2020. Go back in time, if you would, and say, what prompted you originally to write this book and to focus on Henry Wallace?
Well, that's a great question. A good place, obviously a good place of beginning. I had always wanted to write about Henry Wallace. I like to write about the people who have been written out of history. And it's important to understand that while there have been some brilliant books on Henry Wallace, including John Culver's book of about 20 years ago, and frankly, a number of others along the way, the truth of the matter is that Henry Wallace has too frequently been kind of pushed to the sidelines of our story. This happens to vice presidents more often than just with Wallace, but it's a reality. And I knew from a very early age, looking at history and looking at the period, that there was much more to this man than was being discussed. So that was a beginning point and inspiration that went way back. When Donald Trump was elected president, however, I started thinking about writing a book about how Trump became president, what happened, what the reality of our politics was. And my initial instinct was to write about the Republican Party, the degeneration of the party of Lincoln, and frankly, the party of Eisenhower into what it has become today. And in working on that a bit and beginning to do research, I realized that it wasn't so much the story of the Republican Party's degeneration as it was of the Democratic Party's inability to fill the space in our politics on issues of economics and race and global policy. And I wanted to figure out where did the Democratic Party become as cautious as it has become? Where did it begin to pull its punches? Where did it lose that New Deal energy? And as I began that search, it took me back to Wallace, because it was my view that your grandfather Wallace was really the person who had the vision, political success that allowed him to do so.
John, I think you're breaking up there a bit. We may be losing you.
I hope I'm not lost. I can hear you well now,
Okay.
And I hope that we're in good shape.
Yeah, now you're back, I think. Yeah, so,
Thank you.
yeah. No, keep going. Is there more? So.
Well, just the final element of it is that it was my view that if we understood why Democrats rejected Henry Wallace in 1944, and frankly, in the aftermath in 1945 and 1946, because of some of his own mistakes, and we should always be honest about that, but also because of dynamics within the party, we might begin to explain a tendency within the Democratic Party that's been very present over the last 75 to 80 years to be cautious at times when it should be bold. And Henry Wallace became my example, my metaphor, my North Star in explaining what a bold politics might have been.
For those who've not read the book and who are unfamiliar with Henry Wallace generally, how would you describe briefly who Henry Wallace was as a person?
He was a complicated person. He was, first and foremost, as Dashiell Hammett said, he was not a politician. In fact, he was probably one of the least natural politicians that we've had anywhere near the White House, anywhere near the vice presidency. He was, in fact, a farmer, and he was proud of that. He was a scientist, and he was proud of that. He was someone who read widely, was deeply thoughtful, and this is, I think, in reading about him, and I really would appreciate your insights here too. But in my sense of coming to understand Henry Wallace, I came to the conclusion that he was someone who was profoundly curious. Mm-hmm. He was very, very open to new ideas, new approaches, and that was true throughout his life. That curiosity led him to explore religion more deeply than perhaps anyone who's ever held the vice presidency, to explore philosophy, and to explore practical economics and social policy. It made him an ideal cabinet member because as Secretary of Agriculture, he was so open to all of the ideas that might be done, all the ways in which you might respond to a crisis. it also, frankly, made him an incredibly inspiring leader during World War II and in its immediate aftermath, because it was Henry Wallace who, to as great an extent sometimes as Roosevelt, although always deferring to Roosevelt and respecting him, who said, you know, the United States can make it through World War II. It is possible to beat fascism, and then it is possible to come home and beat what he would refer to as Americanized fascism. And in that, he was talking about racism.
I think that the openness that you're referring to was born early. In the early years, he was mentored by George Washington Carver, as you mentioned, in those fields outside of Iowa State, and he kept that interest all his life, and particularly through the lens of science.
Yeah. Yeah.
John, I know several people have looked at this more closely. A number of historians, recently Peter Kuznick and Oliver Stone, through the Untold History of the United States. They've illuminated this question, but how would you answer it? How do you think post-war America would have looked had Henry Wallace, rather than Harry Truman, been vice president on April 12th, 1945, the day that Roosevelt died?
I think we can describe post-war America in great detail. It becomes more complex when we talk about foreign policy, and we can go there and acknowledge that. But this is one of the reasons why I wrote the book, because so much of the storyline as regards Henry Wallace has gotten wrapped up in foreign policy. It's gotten wrapped up in World War II and its immediate aftermath in the Cold War. And I understand that. I don't disregard that. But we underestimate where Wallace was going on on domestic policy. And the interesting thing is that after Wallace was forced out of the vice presidency, Franklin Roosevelt immediately said, well, I'm going to want you in my administration. You may not be my vice president, but I want you near me. And in fact, I read about this at some length. There was clearly a uncomfortable moment in the summer of 1944. Wallace would not be on the ticket, and Wallace didn't fully know what Roosevelt would say. But Wallace still was deeply committed to the New Deal, deeply committed to the ideals. And so he went straight on advocating for Roosevelt, advocating for a anti-fascist vision of World War II and a New Deal vision coming out of it. Roosevelt recognized that and quickly invited him, back into a very close place. In that period, the last months of Franklin Roosevelt's life, Roosevelt and Henry Wallace were in a great deal of communication through telegrams, through personal conversations, and they began to scope out what would be the post-war United States. I would argue to a much greater extent than Harry Truman, Henry Wallace was at the center of that discussion. And this is how it would have been different. Henry Wallace believed that you had to jumpstart the New Deal immediately upon the end of World War II. What that meant was to create massive new programs for job creation. He wrote a book, 60 Million Jobs. And he wrote that if you can imagine, Henry Wallace was constantly writing pamphlets and books. He wrote this in the period where he was being considered for Secretary of Commerce in 1945. And the key thing about it was the vision for the post-war United States to create 60 million new jobs with the idea that the veterans of World War II would come home and have work, meaningful work that would get them right back into the game, but also that the people who had gone into the defense industries, the women, the riveters, as well as people of color, particularly African Americans, who had finally broken some of those color barriers, would not be forced out of those jobs, that there would be a sufficient number of jobs so that instead of dividing people, you could unite them with that classic New Deal vision. At the same time, Henry Wallace was talking about a massive housing program and all sorts of other initiatives that would really bring energy to that post-war era. I cannot tell you exactly how the election results would have gone in 1946, but what I do know is that in 1946, without the programs that Wallace had proposed, without that level of energy, the Democrats lost their ability to govern in many senses. They lost their critical majorities in Congress and were set back. Truman would refer to it as a do-nothing Congress and was very, very critical of it. But the fundamental reality is that the barriers to continuing the New Deal were put in place by that 1946 election. I will argue the possibility that had Henry Wallace become president, he might have been able to renew the New Deal to such an extent that Democrats could have held their majorities and continued forward with a domestic program that might well have been transformative, not merely as regards the economics, but then also in breaking through on those issues of race and gender.
The book that you wrote, I think, is excellent throughout, but particularly compelling is that story of the 44 convention and how close it came to nominating my grandfather. And I was struck years ago by the forces arrayed against him, not only the Southern segregationists, big city bosses, but I came to understand only later that you had because of my grandfather's concern about anti-colonialism and really taking Churchill on that issue. Churchill and the British were very concerned that he not be on the ticket in the 44. And so you realize that he still, Henry Wallace still had the support of 66%, I think with the polling a couple of weeks before the convention of the Democrats across the country. And so it was a pivotal moment in American history that got lost. That story got lost but you and a number of other people have helped to illuminate that considerably in recent years. So when you were doing, John, the research here, can you mention what, as you wrote and did the research, can you mention one or two discoveries or insights that most surprised you about Henry Wallace and his times?
Oh, so beyond just the convention, I thought you were going to look for just insights on the convention, which is a fabulous story and a dramatic story. But the insights on Henry Wallace and his times, I appreciate that question, and I'll take it in the broad sense. Yeah. And I will tell you that the people who attacked Henry Wallace will tell you more about Henry Wallace than perhaps anything his supporters ever said. He was attacked for being open to and interested in a variety of religious traditions, for being respectful of people who explored their spirituality. He was a devout Christian and someone who could quote the Bible, and particularly Psalms and certain sections of the Bible from memory. He was quite remarkable in this regard. But he was fascinated by and open to many spiritual paths, and this made him deeply committed to the outreach to people who did not share his faith, to Jews, to Muslims, to others. He was a reconciling figure in this regard. And the more I read about that, I think there's a book to be written on Henry Wallace's religious interest and his own religion. And I think that today that would be highly respected, understood, and well regarded. In his time, it was frequently attacked. And so that's one element of it. I think also his openness to political ideology. He was comfortable with ideologies he disagreed with. He studied them. He read extensively. He once said that, they're talking about books he had read. I think it was the New York Times asked him, and he referred to the Bible and Marx, and he said, yeah, these are things I'm reading and with great interest. And the reason I say that is that he felt compelled to understand that which he agreed with and also that which he disagreed with, and to find those meeting grounds, find that common place. The final thing about him, and this is, again, he was attacked for that. Wallace was, of course, attacked for that. The final thing he was attacked for, and it's my favorite one, is he was incredibly physically fit. And he was athletic. He loved learning new sports, and he was a big tennis player throughout his life. And I know this may sound like, yeah, of course, every politician today makes a big deal, except for maybe our current president, makes a big deal about their physical fitness and about what their exercise regime is. He was attacked for that. It was viewed as somehow, well, that's not very presidential. And so I guess I would sum it up as saying that the more I studied Henry Wallace, the more I came to the conclusion that he was a perfect candidate for the 21st century. Unfortunately, he was running in the mid 20th century. To shifting a little bit to the 21st century here, you write at one point, like Eleanor Roosevelt, Henry Wallace was an advocate for those whose voices were rarely heard in corridors of power. So in recent years here in America, who do you find to have been not just the most emphatic, but the most effective advocates for those voices who are rarely heard in corridors of power? There are so many names we could do. And that's one of the things, half of this book is a revisiting of Henry Wallace and going deep into stories of those particular fights in the period 1942, 43, 44, and kind of through the 40s. But the other half of the book is really an exploration of what came after, because I believe that certain patterns were set in place. And in that period afterwards, I think I would start with someone who is not considered to have been very effective, but I think history is going to be kinder and kinder to him over time, and that's George McGovern. And of course, George McGovern was a Henry Wallace fan, right, and attended the 1948 Progressive Party Convention, along with, I believe, Coretta Scott, who would become Coretta Scott King, and other remarkable figures. But going forward, I would say Jesse Jackson with the Rainbow Coalition and what he forced the Democratic Party to begin to explore. And then as we jump forward, there's so many members of Congress and other folks, people like Ron Dellums along the way, who I often point to in this regard. But you asked about the 21st century. And so I will say that there's no question in my mind that Bernie Sanders has sought to make those linkages. Bernie Sanders, who I spent time at your grandfather's birthplace with. And then I suspect that if Henry Wallace had lived to the ripe old age of 130, he would be a huge fan today and correctly respectful of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and Ayanna Pressley, and Ro Khanna, and Pramila Jayapal, and a number of these new members of Congress who are really taking it up and trying to bring this broader perspective into the politics of our country. You'll note that I'm citing mostly politicians. I could also talk about people like Bill McKibben and the folks with the Sunrise Movement and all kinds of other folks who I believe have done tremendous work. I think Henry Wallace would be a huge fan of Black Lives Matter because of their focus on structural racism and their determination to go deeper. That's probably too long an answer but it goes to the heart of my faith that Henry Wallace seemed never to be discouraged by changing times. If anything, he was racing toward the future. He wanted to see those next moments.
Right.
There's a famous speech he gave, and it's my favorite of his speeches. I cite a lot of it in the book. But in 1947, he was asked by African-American fraternities to come and speak in Tulsa, Oklahoma, at a particular fraternity's annual event. And when he went there, he said, look, I understand that you're asking me as a former vice president to come and speak to you and tell you, how much I understand things and that. But the fact is that you know better than I the circumstance of Black Americans or of African Americans. And so let me tell you this. In the United States today, in the same city, a white child and a Black child born on the same day will have different lifespans. The white child will live 10 years longer. And then he closed by saying, we fight for those 10 years. And his vision was that he wanted to get to the place where we were talking about structural racism. He wanted to get to the place where we were talking about fundamental environmental issues and fundamental societal issues. And so I think he'd be very excited by the people who go to the root causes, by the people we call radicals, right. Because I think that he would have been proudly, I know that he proudly identified as someone who had that sensibility.
The influence that he's had on members of his family have been overwhelming. He died when I was 16 of ALS, and I knew him as well as a 16-year-old teenager could. We spent summers at the family farm, and one of the most powerful stories reading about him before he died, and also particularly later, was the campaigning in the South during the time of segregation and refusing to speak to integrated audiences and being pelted with rocks or whatever that they're getting hit with. And here you have who was the second most powerful man in the United States 5 years earlier as vice president, running for president in 1948, refusing to speak in segregated settings and suffering that impact, and understanding what that must have been like for him and what it did for his worldview and his understanding of power structures in the United States. You know, you mentioned a few minutes ago spiritual values, and my grandfather framed many of his speeches, as you mentioned, by reference to the biblical prophets, Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. I find Donald Trump's values antithetical to my grandfather's values, and as a Christian, I find Trump's policies to be the antithesis of Christianity, despite his appeal to a white evangelical base. But what more do you think the progressive community in this country can do to address not just the economic needs, but the spiritual needs of human beings and those values taught by all faith traditions? Hope, not fear; generosity, not greed; honesty, not falsehood; compassion, not hate.
Oh, that's such a fine question, and you're a Wallace, whether you like it or not.
There was a DNA test just recently. I think that's right. So,
well, because it wouldn't need the DNA test. It speaks to that's the sensibility. Henry Wallace, it was very interesting at his funeral, and I assume you were there. I hope I'm right.
In Iowa. Yes.
No,
there was one in Ridgefield, Connecticut, and I went to the one in Iowa. Yeah.
In Iowa. Yeah. At the one in Connecticut, they didn't have big eulogies. They just quoted from Psalms, and but these two perfectly chosen quotes that spoke to a justice sensibility. And one of the things that Henry Wallace understood, and it was a brilliant understanding, one that so few of our politicians have today, was that when you spoke in the language of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, also showing regard for Buddhism, for Hinduism, for all the religions, that you could find touchstones that might reach people who were not otherwise reached.
Right.
And he sought to do that with such a determination, such a passion. I think that he quoted from the Old Testament, from Psalms, and from the Bible in general, because he loved doing it. I think it was real to him, and it was something he enjoyed. He didn't do it, it wasn't forced, it was comfortable. Right. But he also did it with a knowledge of that this was a way that you could reach someone who might otherwise not be reached, that you could find a touchstone and a common ground. When I looked at the reporting on Henry Wallace in the African-American newspapers of that time, and in the diaries and essays of particularly, I think a lot of people in the African-American community, they heard that. they heard him reaching out, not merely with words, but also with shared values, and many of these values rooted in morality. And the other thing he did with this, which is really interesting, is, and I have here, I've got my little things, he would always, about everything that every issue that came up, he'd write a pamphlet. This is America Must Choose. He wrote one called Whose Constitution? He was always exploring different issues. And the fascinating thing about it was that in all of these, he would integrate American history with morality. He would acknowledge failings in the American experiment, for which he had a lot of reverence for the American experiment, but he would acknowledge failings along the way in a very Christian way. He would say, look, none of us are perfect, but we can strive toward these higher values, this better place. And I think along with Roosevelt, and we shouldn't underestimate, because Roosevelt did a lot of this as well. Along with Roosevelt, he did a fantastic job in the 1930s and 1940s of blending morality with politics, and of setting higher standards rooted in historic moral values. And they failed at times. Look, I acknowledge in my book that they made bad mistakes sometimes. They were not always perfect. But I think people are very forgiving. And I think if they believe you are aspiring to a moral vision as well as a practical improvement of the circumstance, that's how you build coalitions that win the kind of support that Franklin Roosevelt and Henry Wallace won at the peak of the New Deal.
And I think Americans will be listening for the candidate that best speaks to those historic moral values in November. I hope so on that. So the one piece that interested me, that seems to have been de-emphasized by many Democratic politicians in recent years, has been an international focus. I spent a fair amount of time on Capitol Hill the last 15 years. But when you go back to the New Deal, and FDR and Henry Wallace and others were focused equally abroad, not only because of World War II, but the post-war, their post-war vision that you've spoken about as well. There was a global perspective always to the New Deal, through multilateral relations, through treaties, through foreign aid. Do you have a sense, it seems to me that what concerns me a bit is that many Democratic politicians today are focused almost entirely on the domestic side, yet the impact of our nation, from the military budget, fragile states, global health concerns, environmental policy, it's tied up not only with the US's health, but the world's health and development. In contrast to the Republicans' isolationism here, in so many ways, how can the Democratic Party strengthen a progressive international perspective?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that these two questions go together. Your previous question about the faith and the morality, and this question about internationalism and of a global perspective. And I write about it a lot in the book. It's actually central to one of the chapters in the book, because Henry Luce spoke of your grandfather's nemesis in many ways, spoke of an American century. Now, the interesting thing was that Henry Luce was an internationalist, the publisher of Time and Life. He was an internationalist. He wasn't an isolationist. But his vision of America in the world was to take full advantage of it, right? To be linked to other places, but to have America come out way ahead economically, and also to try and bend those other places always to America's will. Your grandfather responded to that with horror. That was not his moral view. His view was that it would be, instead of an American century, the century of the common man, and I would add woman. And this clash really gets to a deeper understanding of the question of internationalism. Are we interested in the rest of the world simply to dominate it, to be the dominant force in the world, or are we interested in the rest of the world to be a part of it, to perhaps be a city on a hill to do things better. And your grandfather very much believed in America leading by example, but also to recognize that people in other places had aspirations and hopes and needs. And I write in the book a lot about the fact that this is what really got him in trouble in the Roosevelt administration. Not so much with Franklin Roosevelt, but with the more conservative players in the administration. When Henry Wallace was overseeing the war effort, and he was getting the supplies for the war, that was Henry Wallace's job in 1942 into 1943. And a lot of those supplies came from foreign countries. And he and his aides made it a point to say, you don't exploit the workers in those places, right? If you're going to get resources from other places, try not to exploit the soil, try not to exploit the place, and certainly don't exploit the people. Look for a way to treat them fairly. They are not Americans, but they are human beings, and they need to be treated in a humane and decent way. And that informed his passion as regards anti-colonialism, which he wrote a fabulous pamphlet on. It also informed his opposition to imperialism and toward always being on a war stance. Now, this became very controversial. There were people who thought that he was too soft on Russia, too willing to find a common ground. But I will emphasize, he was not alone in that. If you read the writings and the speeches of Wendell Willkie, the Republican nominee for president in 1940, saying much the same thing. If you read what Roosevelt said, this was a knowing understanding that there were disagreements with the Soviet Union, of course, and those disagreements could be intense, and that there was a skepticism, and it was expressed by Willkie and by Roosevelt and by Henry Wallace. But there was also a desire to find some route forward that was not involved with militarism and war, but indeed that might possibly find common ground. And at the root of that was putting the United States on the side of the common man and the common woman around the world, with the argument that ultimately a just and fair and equitable United States would serve as an example that people around the world would aspire to, and that leading by example really did matter. So he had an idea for a New Deal for the world, as he had an idea for a New Deal for the United States.
I appreciated Aaron Copland and Fanfare for the Common Man for years, not knowing.
No way.
Until an article in the New Yorker, a decade or so ago, that Aaron Copland wrote that after Henry Wallace's speech.
And see, a typical politician would have made sure you knew that by the time you were 16.
When I was born, exactly. John, the fight for the soul of the Democratic Party was published in the spring of this year, almost exactly when COVID struck in March. Yeah. I think that's right. But what's been the range of responses that you've had of reviewers and readers? I've seen many pro comments along the way, but what have you found to be personally the response that you've heard from readers and critics since the book's come out?
Well, the fight over Henry Wallace continues. That's the important thing to understand, and people are in their camps. And so I've had very thoughtful reviews from folks who are like, nope, let's not be saying too many nice things about Henry Wallace. And these are not cruel reviews. These are reviews from folks who are saying, oh, be careful there. Yeah. This kind of politics is a dangerous politics. It's too Henry Wallace, Bernie Sanders, be careful for those guys. So those exist. There've been, I have to say that overall the reviews have been wonderful, and like any writer, you're thrilled to get them. But the best response I had just a week or so ago, it wasn't very long. A group of the frontline organizers for Bernie Sanders' campaign, these were all women who had organized his rallies and events and things back in 2015 going into early 2016. One of the women who was a part of it got my email, and she emailed me and she said, we decided, because we were sort of depressed, we decided to read your book with our book group. And so there's a book group of all these different organizers. And they said, we finished the book and we liked it, and that was great. And we wondered if you would join us for our discussion. So they had a Zoom discussion, and there were folks from all over the country who had worked on this campaign. And they were all young, probably all under 30 or early 30s. And every single one of them got it. They got the point I was trying to make, probably better than any reviewer ever will. And that is that the fight for the soul of the Democratic Party, which your grandfather engaged in which George McGovern engaged in which Shirley Chisholm engaged in which Jesse Jackson engaged in which people are engaged right up to this day, is an ongoing struggle over whether it will be a party rooted in a set of values and ideals, or whether it will simply be a political machine, a political operation. And all of these people on this call, all these young women, were skilled organizers, super engaged political people. They knew the nitty gritty of politics. They understood the dynamic very, very well. And yet they had not lost their idealism. They had not lost their hope for a politics that was better, that was deeper and smarter, and frankly, that aspired to economic and social and racial justice, to save the planet and to end the wars. And I just loved talking with people who were, for lack of a better term, reverent as regards Henry Wallace. And one of the women did tell me in the midst of the conversation that she had been the organizer of an event that the Sanders campaign did at the Wallace Farm, or in Iowa. And it was just, it was lovely. It's what politics should be. Political parties should understand their history. They should understand the bright sides and also the dark sides in that history. And there is a rising young generation, which maybe, if I'm lucky, I've contributed a little bit to their understanding of that wholeness and their desire to win some of the fights that your grandfather started.
That's really well said. And I think that if my grandfather were alive, there's no doubt in my mind that he would be out campaigning for Joe Biden at this time in America's history. I think we're getting to the time for audience Q&A, but this has been somewhat of a family affair. So in the final minute or so, could you just say a word about your book's dedication to your mother, Mary, and you call her the truest progressive I know.
Yeah, my mom is 90 years old, almost 90 years old, and she lives in rural southeastern Wisconsin. She was born along the Wisconsin River in the small farm towns there. She was born in the Depression, and there wasn't a school in her hometown, and so every morning before dawn, her mother would put her on the milk train to go 20 miles on the train to go to kindergarten. So as a 5-year-old, she had some of the best Depression era stories you'd ever hear. And yet she came out of it all incredibly optimistic with great faith. And as a University of Wisconsin student, she had the opportunity to show Eleanor Roosevelt around the campus. And that made my mother a passionate believer. I think she probably had it in her before. She was of an old Wisconsin progressive family, but it made her a passionate believer in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the United Nations and a very global vision. And so at 90, she continues to volunteer in politics. And I don't want to take too much time from our questions, but I'll tell you the best story I know. I am a reporter. I go out and cover politics. I covered former Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker's announcement of his presidential campaign in 2015. It was at a big hall in Waukesha, Wisconsin. It was a very hot day, and I was inside for a long time. And as I was leaving, I got a call from my mother, and she said, "Oh, I thought I'd see you today." And I said, "Mom, I was at Scott Walker's announcement of candidacy. You wouldn't go anywhere near Scott Walker, and conservative Republican." And she said, No, I was outside blocking traffic with Voces de la Frontera, the immigrant rights group." So that's my mom.
Great. I think we're on for audience Q&A, Mac. So,
Hey, John. Hey, David. This has been
Yeah.
excellent. We do have some questions that have come in from the audience throughout the discussion, and I'll share as many of those with you now as I can. Here's a question from Jerry, who says he's interested in Wallace's evolution before he joined the Roosevelt administration. He was a Republican before then. Why and how did his political views change?
Well, David may have something to say on this as well, but I will tell you, I'm not sure his political views changed. He was a progressive Republican, and there's a page in the book where I tell about each of his political changes, and so he was a Republican, and then he left the Republican Party to support Teddy Roosevelt's 1912 presidential campaign, came back into the Republican Party, left in 24 to back the campaign of Robert M. La Follette and the progressives against the Republicans and the Democrats, came back in a little bit to the Republican Party, was drawn back out by Franklin Roosevelt, and stayed with the Democrats during the Roosevelt era, ultimately ran for president as an independent progressive, and then in the 1950s endorsed Dwight Eisenhower for president because he believed that Eisenhower was serious about taking on the military-industrial complex and racism. So the truth of the matter is that Henry Wallace's ideology was what we're talking about here: economic and social and racial justice, saving the planet, ending the wars. And that took him to wherever I think he felt he could advance it, wherever he felt that you could do well. And the great meeting point, to go to the core of the question, the great point was that when Franklin Roosevelt reached out to him, they had a real meeting of the minds. There's simply no question of that. If you read the diaries and the letters and that point in 1932 into 1933, including a moment at Roosevelt House, where these two men figured out that they could do something together. And Franklin Roosevelt wanted Henry Wallace in his administration because Henry Wallace did bring in a great deal of farm country, or at least had a way to speak to them. He also brought in some of those liberal and progressive Republicans. And so it was a two-way street. Wallace wanted to achieve things for rural America, especially at that point, and Roosevelt wanted somebody who could connect him to rural America.
yeah, and I think that last point really hits it. It's at that point in the 30s, it was really which administration would be more responsive to those farming the land, small family farmers, the soil, which administration would protect the soil. And it went right back to Henry Wallace's concern as a scientist and a farmer.
A few people are asking about the 1944 ticket, including Susan Berkon and Irving Lee. Irving puts it this way: why didn't FDR try harder to keep Wallace as his vice president for the 1944 campaign?
Sure. We don't have enough time to go into all the details. But look, there are two presidents of the United States who made a mistake in choosing, in seeking their final term. One was Abraham Lincoln, who forced Hannibal Hamlin off the ticket and replaced him with Andrew Johnson, who was a horrible, horrible vice president and a horrible president. And it was a lesser sin, if you will, as regards Roosevelt. Roosevelt was concerned about the 1944 race. He was seeking a fourth term as president of the United States. No one had ever done that. He was in the midst of a global war that was overwhelming in its demands, and his health was terrible. And so at that point, he was determined, I think it's fair to say, and I read every perspective on this, and I think I can fairly say this, that he determined that he needed the party to be as together as it could be. He needed a united Democratic Party. He knew that there were strong forces in the party that did not like Henry Wallace and that were opposed to him because Wallace, I would argue, was raising the issue of race at a fundamental level and also was raising a number of other economic issues at fundamental levels. And so what he did was he wrote a note to the convention in which he said, I've known Henry Wallace for years. He's my friend. I trust him. If I was a delegate, I would vote for Henry Wallace. But he also said, I'm not going to dictate to this convention, because he got in trouble for dictating to the 1940 convention when he said they had to take Wallace. And so he left it open. And he also indicated that he was open to William O. Douglas and to Harry Truman. It happened that Harry Truman had a lot of allies in the Democratic Party leadership at that point, and there was a lot of manipulation. That is the simple reality of it. I'm not going to try and go into Roosevelt's mind and say that he regretted the choice, because that's a more complex claim to make. But what I will say is that he recognized that he needed Henry Wallace with him going out of that 1944 election. And he offered Wallace any domestic cabinet position that Wallace wanted. Wallace took commerce. Had Roosevelt lived, I think that you would have had a situation where Henry Wallace continued to be the dynamic force, aside from the president, in that fourth term.
Right, and I would just add that I think John mentioned at the top part there that Roosevelt was exhausted, just gotten back from Yalta, I think, and it was he wasn't willing to fight in the same way of 1940. I think my grandfather was being out of the country up until about 2 weeks before the convention, where there was a lot of things shifting in Washington, D.C., did not help his chances either. But the remarkable thing to me growing up was he never seemed bitter, or he was so focused on the future, on the plants that he was working with, the hybridization that he was involved with at the end of his life, that there was very little time there was no time for bitterness as far as I could see.
I agree with you. In fact, Henry Wallace had an amazing ability to, he might gripe about it. In his diaries, you'll see a little bit of grumbling now and again about something, but he had an amazing ability to put things behind him. Yeah. And to go to the next point. He wasn't just that it wasn't just Christian forgiveness or something like that. It was also that it was a function of being born on a farm. I went to Orion, Iowa, where he was born. There's nothing next to that farm. It's on an unpaved road. And so if you wanted to know people and to work with them, you had to forgive them. You had to, find ways to take the next step. And I just think that was hardwired into the guy.
We have a question from Roosevelt House friend and advisory board member, Tony Stepansky. He asks, well, first he mentions that he recently watched Oliver Stone's The Untold History of the United States and gained a new remarkable insight into Henry Wallace. Is it fair to say that he was simply intellectually and culturally so far ahead of his time that his views could never gain traction because of the turbulent political climate associated with the war?
It's a very, very good question. I would argue that his views did gain traction. I think that we don't have enough time to go into it in great detail, but after some of the internal fights in the administration in 1943, Henry Wallace went on the road. He spent an immense amount of time speaking to groups across the country. And the incredible thing about it is that as he went across the country, as he traveled, he was reaching out to people who had been left out of our politics, to African Americans, to Latinos, to members of the Jewish community who were so concerned at that point about the Holocaust in World War II and what was being learned, to women. He was a strong supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment. And so I think he built a constituency. And my view is that if he had been renominated for vice president and they had had that ticket, they would have won in 1944. And so I think his ideas gained traction. I do respect the question, though, to say that Henry Wallace's style, his approach was something different. And that openness to ideas, that openness to religious, racial, ethnic diversity, he was ahead of the curve, I think, in so many ways. The fact of the matter is that if Henry Wallace sat down today with a group of activists, young activists with the Sunrise Movement or Black Lives Matter or any number of other organizations, I think he could fit right into the discussion. I think he would be totally comfortable. And when people are saying, yeah, we've got to deal with structural racism, he would be right on. Let's talk about it. Let's go there. And so, yeah, in that sense, I do think that while many of his ideas got traction, his approach was ahead of the time. There's little doubt of that. And the party bosses hated him for that. Yeah. They did not like the idea of going out and and talking directly to a whole bunch of people and trying to win them over to a set of ideas.
A couple of people, Ding Pageron and Vincent McGee, among them, are asking about the atom bomb. Vincent asks it this way: as vice president, did Wallace know about the atom bomb project? Any idea of his thinking on atomic weapons and the use of the two bombs?
Yeah, he knew a lot about it. The fact of the matter is that he had a closeness which comes out later. Albert Einstein endorsed him for president in 1948, and so he communicated. I won't say that he knew everything about the Manhattan Project. That would not be my argument, but he clearly knew about some of these discussions, some of this exploration. He had a depth that I think he would have brought to the discussion of whether to use the bomb, and that I think there's some people who assume, oh no, he wouldn't have, or he would have, and they make all sorts of assumptions. What I always say is, it's my impression that he would have come at it with knowledge that frankly Harry Truman didn't have, and with an understanding of it and of the development and perspective on it. I think he would have consulted more widely, and I like to think that he would have had greater doubts about using it, but I'll let his grandson close that circle.
No, I think that's a very good answer, John. I would leave it. I think I would leave it there. That's a good answer. Great answer.
There's a sort of general question about the Democratic Party. David asks, which is a larger problem for Democrats, the fear of appearing too strident or the fear of alienating the center?
Today, it is a fear of alienating campaign donors and a fear of alienating an elusive swing voter who I'm not sure even exists anymore. And so the Democratic Party at its highest level and at its strategic level too frequently still fears the idea of building a coalition, a great coalition that expands beyond its base, but doesn't try to expand to the right, but rather expands out to the great mass of people and speaks to their needs. And I think that we've seen again and again and again the Democratic Party pull its punches when it should have thrown them. We're in a moment right now with filling the vacancy created by the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And there will be a lot of debate about how to go forward and what to do with that. I happen to be in the camp that says the party should fight like with everything it's got to make sure that another seat on the Supreme Court is not stolen. And B, if it is, to talk about court reform. And I don't call it court packing. I am a New Dealer. And so I believe it's court reform. And I believe that that many of the frustrations that Roosevelt experienced and that Wallace experienced remain today. And at some point, the Democratic Party is going to have to be more than just a managerial party. It has to again be a transformative party, a party that seeks to bring fundamental change. Mm-hmm. And I know there's people who have doubts about Joe Biden. I don't think it's about Joe Biden. I think it's about the times. And frankly, I think that the next president of the United States is going to have to address COVID-19, mass unemployment, racial injustice, a climate crisis, and a Pentagon budget that's out of control. And a failure to address that, failure to rise to that, will put us back into the cycle of Democrats winning and then losing in the midterm elections, falling back. And that cycle's got to be broken. I think it's only broken with a New Deal style vision, not repeating the New Deal, but with the energy and the spirit of it.
An anonymous audience member asks, following up on that, about Wallace's thinking on the Supreme Court. Was he a reformer in that regard? Or it's just a general invitation to speak on the topic, I guess.
Yeah, I've read a lot about his views on it, and I speak of it with some authority. He was very supportive of Franklin Roosevelt's effort to expand the court when it was being done, but he also acknowledged that it was done poorly, that the effort was not successful, and that it harmed the New Deal. It harmed the New Deal coalition. And so if we're honest about it, and I think this is classic Henry Wallace, he he was with the president. He shared the president's view that something had to be done to get the court to stop blocking New Deal programs. But yet, when it didn't work and when it did, frankly, a lot of damage to Democratic Party unity, he spoke about that quite openly. So the bottom line is, again, be very careful about assuming. I always try to do this. I talk about the New Deal, but I don't talk about just repeating the New Deal. I talk about that spirit, the energy of it, that openness to ideas, that openness to building coalitions. And so be careful to assume that Roosevelt's efforts to address the court in the 1930s are parallel to the moment we may find ourselves in now. These are very different times and a very different set of issues in play. And the only lesson I would take from Wallace and Roosevelt in the 1930s on the courts is that if you're going to seek to expand the court, as Abraham Lincoln did when he was president, then what you need to do is a great deal of education, which both Roosevelt and Wallace were really great at. But frankly, they were involved in so many other things that I don't think they did the amount of education they needed to back in the 1930s. If people are going to talk about it today, there has to be an immense amount of education that this is not an assault on the rule of law or on the judiciary. It is, in fact, a realization of its promise.
Are you both okay to do a couple more questions before we finish up?
David?
Sure.
Okay. Steve Auerbach brings up the topic of the attacks on Henry Wallace as a communist Soviet sympathizer and asks whether those attacks were based on discrediting him for his domestic leftism on race and economics.
It's a very, very good question. And David may have more to add to this. First off, it's very important to understand that Henry Wallace was a capitalist, and actually a pretty capable capitalist. But he was ethical, and he believed in an ethical approach to it. As regards his determination to try and find another route than the route we ended up on with the Cold War, he said and did things that gave his critics ammunition. There's little doubt of that they found things to attack. They found lines in speeches and responses to particular issues, and they attacked. And that's politics. That's a given. I think that you are right, however, or the question is right, that many of the attacks on Wallace came from people who knew that he was not a communist, and in fact knew that while he was trying to build out a broad coalition, if you will, a kind of popular front coalition in the post-war era, that he would be his own man and that he had a clear vision. And so why did they attack so viciously? There were two reasons. Number one, third-party candidates, as in 48 he was, always get attacked. There's always a desire to view them as spoilers and people who might prevent the party that they are somewhat closer to from prevailing. And number two, yes, there was a deep, deep concern on the part of a great many folks that here was a guy who was scoping out a much bolder vision. And that vision did involve economic, social, and racial justice. He spoke about gender. He spoke about militarism. He spoke about imperialism. He spoke about anti-colonialism. And I have zero doubt that there were a lot of folks who wanted to kind of make it clear that that avenue was not open, that you couldn't go that far and you would be punished if you did. And the best example of it, my great example of it in the book, is that in 1952, the people who left the Democratic Party in 1948 because they were in favor of segregation were welcomed back into the party. And one of the segregationists who left in 48 was made the nominee for vice president in 52, Senator Sparkman. On the other hand, the people who left because they said that segregation had to end immediately and who were really profoundly passionate on these issues were not welcomed back, and in fact were avoided and shunted to the side and often diminished. It's interesting that in the post-48 campaign period, Wallace was often treated poorly by his fellow Democrats, even people who had worked with him, On the other hand, he was treated very, very well by Dwight Eisenhower, who corresponded with him, who showed great respect for him, and frankly consulted with him, asked him what he thought about things. And so it's an interesting dynamic there that that he could find his common ground with Eisenhower, and in fact, I think a quite good relationship. But somehow it couldn't be found with the Democrats, who I think feared what he was trying to make their party.
And just to add 2 quick points on that. One, I think my grandfather was always very conscious of the role that the Soviet Union had played in helping to win World War II. He was in Russia, actually traveling in Russia on a trip that he had been hoping to make and that Roosevelt had been hoping that he would make, that would include a trip to Mongolia and also to meet with Chiang Kai-shek in China. But he happened to be in Russia where we were sending Lend-Lease aid at the time. And he was conscious of that the D-Day would not have been able to take place without the Soviet Union. And so in those early years, right in the late 45, 46, 47, he saw that window of opportunity that would eventually close, probably by 48, when he was trying to continue to make the case. But I think the larger issue in the question that you just asked, Mac, is I think there truly was at that time in the 40s and early 50s a milieu of fear that was conveyed in this country, and that we're seeing today by so much of the right wing, hard right, conservative radio, and groups that really seek to, and I think a phrase that my grandfather used, to poison the channels of public information. And I think that fear that we're seeing abroad in our own country as well was very much in evidence in the early 1950s. And so some of the people's concern, I think, for my grandfather's attempt to work with the Soviet Union was based not in the ideology of the domestic front, but just true fear that had been inculcated and instilled in them by preachers who, in one of Trump's advisors, Roger Stone, I think his famous phrase was, "Hate is stronger than love." And I think that we're seeing that at times in our own country now. So,
yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't just add one more line to that. Totally agreeing with everything you've just said. That, of course, we haven't even discussed Henry Wallace's great essay, "The Danger of American Fascism." Yeah. And in fact, he was very, very conscious that if we got ourselves into a position where we were in constant conflict with other countries, if we were on a war footing, a Cold War or an actual war footing, that it would be dramatically harder to advance domestic change. And one of the last expressions of his life was an expression when he could no longer speak, written on his tablet that he had, of concern about the Vietnam War, and concern that it would, a little bit of extrapolation here, but essentially concern that it would scuttle the domestic programs of the Johnson administration. And he was right. Yeah. Again and again and again, he was right. And when I talked to George McGovern some years ago about Henry Wallace, George McGovern said that it was only over time that McGovern, came to understand how right Wallace had been. That Wallace understood the intersection of domestic and foreign policy, and how if you did certain things in foreign policy, it was going to limit your capacity domestically, and vice versa. And that as McGovern suggested, there was a genius in that understanding that has very rarely been understood by American political leaders.
And we've gone a little bit long, but just to finish up, I'll ask one last question. This is a combination, really, from David and Ellen Guisti. The question is, can Biden be an interim Democrat in the Wallace tradition? And attached to that, can progressives, or what evidence is there that our country would elect a Wallace progressive?
There, David, we have a real question, don't we? First off, to Biden as an interim, I don't think he's not so much in the Wallace tradition. He's more in, frankly, the FDR tradition. Remember that in 1932, when FDR ran for president, He ran as a liberal, but not as the man we came to know. If you look back at his speeches from 1932, there was a caution about spending, among other things, and there was not a fully realized New Deal vision. What happened with Henry Roosevelt, or with Franklin Roosevelt, was that when he was elected, he understood a lot of the dynamics that were in play at the time, and he knew that he would have to do more in many ways than he had promised. That's very rare in our politics. Usually politicians do less than they promise, but FDR realized that the moment demanded more. Wallace helped him to realize that and helped him to see how they might do it. So they became a very, very good team, along with others like Harold Ickes and Francis Perkins, and we can name the list. For Biden, the great question is, and this is challenging, because Biden has a much longer career, even though Roosevelt had a career in domestic politics. Biden's is much longer. Can he be open enough to, bring in the people who might help him to be that bigger and bolder president, to be more than just an interim president, but to actually be a president for the moment? And two factors give me a little bit of hope in this regard. Number one, he has shown an openness to the climate movements that is encouraging. He's not all the way there, and I can point out 10 things I disagree with him on, including fracking. But he has shown an openness that is somewhat encouraging. He's shown an openness in some other ways. And here's the deal. Roosevelt was made a great president by the moment in which he was serving and by the movements that existed in the time when he was serving. And it happened that Eleanor Roosevelt and Henry Wallace helped to bring those movements into Roosevelt's focus and into his inner circle to a much greater extent than might have happened otherwise. And for Biden, I think the key is he will assume the presidency if he wins, and I think we've got 40-some days ahead of us, which will be very challenging, and then an aftermath. But if Biden wins, he will assume the presidency with enormous challenges. The challenge of COVID and of mass unemployment and all the other things we discussed. He will have to move immediately. The right response to it will be a massive stimulus. The right response to it will be to use that stimulus not merely to address the pain of the moment, but also to make structural shifts that can allow us to transition into the future, to fight off the deficit hawks, and to do that which is necessary. It has to be a New Deal response. If it isn't a New Deal response, the Republicans will be back in 2022 and 2024, and they will say, you elected this other guy and he didn't do the job. And so Biden's challenge is to rise to the occasion, and it may be that the moment and the movements make him do it. And that's fine by me. I'm not somebody who's, aside from Henry Wallace, I'm not somebody who puts too many people up on pedestals. I tend to believe that people can be made great by movements, and I would be remiss, I want to take it back to David here in one sec, but I would be remiss if I didn't say that Henry Wallace is a hero of my book. There's a lot of other heroes, but perhaps the biggest touchstone in my book is A. Philip Randolph. And he was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and the guy who launched the March on Washington movement, not in 1963, but in 1940, 1941. And A. Philip Randolph believed that as good as Roosevelt was on some things, he was not good enough on a lot of other things. And he constantly said that you had to pressure the president of the United States and the vice president of the United States to respond to the challenges of the moment. And so in Randolph's spirit, and in the spirit of the man who respected him, Henry Wallace, I will say that Biden could be a great president, but he will probably only be a great president if we make him be a great president.
And I completely agree with John on those points that he was making. And I'll just end with a quick thought that Martin Luther King used to talk about the content of character, of a person's character. And I think unquestionably Biden's character and his intellect and his empathy makes him a man for this time in a way that almost no other year would have worked in the same way for Biden. So I'm hopeful and looking forward to, with a suitable amount of caution, to early November. So thank you.
Thank you both so much, John and David. We should really finish there. This has been fantastic. If you have any quick goodbye or final word, now's the time.
My thanks to the, I'll let John have the final word. My thanks to the Roosevelt House for putting this together, and it's been a delight to be with John. So.
I want to thank David and all the folks at Roosevelt House. I also want to thank Katrina vanden Heuvel, who is the longtime editor, now editorial director and publisher of The Nation magazine. She has been just a tremendous champion for this book and for a lot of things I've done. And her father, William vanden Heuvel, who has responded so kindly to this book. And I know that they both suffered a great loss of late. Katrina's husband, Stephen Cohen, passed away on Friday. And so I close off with an expression of great love and solidarity for Katrina and for William vanden Heuvel. And finally, just to say that I didn't get to know the Wallace family as I was writing this book because I felt I shouldn't reach out to them at that point because they frankly are involved in a lot of philanthropy and things of that nature, and I didn't want to go that route. But I have been profoundly honored to meet the members of the Wallace family since writing the book, and it's been such a wonderful thing to realize that that the good spirit of this man lives on in his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And so it's just an honor to be with David today and an honor to be with all of you.
Thank you both. And with that, we're finished.